History remembers its titans, its conquerors, its revolutionaries, its queens, who ruled empires and shaped the destinies of millions. Their names are etched in stone, their stories told and retold until they become legends. But history has a quieter, more subtle narrative, whispered in the grand, empty halls of forgotten palaces. It is a story of those who did not shape the world, but were shaped by it. Those who were not the storm, but the feathers caught in its gale. It is the story of the survivors. Today we begin the journey into one such life. The life of a princess born to rule a jewel-box kingdom, who would instead spend a lifetime searching for a home. She was born into the heart of the old world, a world of divine right and dynastic power, just as a new world of nationalism and revolution was preparing to tear it all down. Her name was Alice of Bourbon-Parma. Her story is not one of grand political maneuvers or scandalous affairs. It is a more intimate epic, a tale of profound loss endured with quiet dignity. It is the story of a daughter who witnessed her father's murder, a princess who lost her homeland before she was 10 years old, and a woman who would find love and build a new dynasty, not on a throne, but in the permanent state of exile. To understand her, we must first understand the fragile, beautiful, and doomed world into which she was born. We must travel back to the Duchy of Parma, in the heart of a fractured Italy, on the cusp of a revolution that would change Europe forever. In the middle of the 19th century, Italy was merely a geographic expression, a peninsula of competing states, ancient cities, and simmering resentments. It was a patchwork quilt of kingdoms and duchies, each with its own ruler, its own traditions, and often its own foreign master. The shadow of the mighty Austrian Empire loomed large, particularly over the north. Austria controlled the wealthy regions of Lombardy and Venetia directly, and through family ties and military alliances, it effectively dominated the independent duchies of Tuscany, Modena, and Parma. These states were satellites, buffer zones meant to secure Austria's southern flank and suppress the dangerous new idea that was sweeping the continent, nationalism. At the heart of this volatile landscape was the Duchy of Parma and Piacenza. It was not a large territory, but it was rich in culture and strategic importance. This was the land of Verdi's music, of Correggio's art, and of the world-famous Parmesan cheese. Its capital, Parma, was a sophisticated city of elegant theaters, majestic churches, and refined society. For a time, it had even been part of Napoleon Bonaparte's empire, ruled by his second wife, Empress Marie-Louise. But by 1849, the year of Alice's birth, Parma was once again in the hands of its traditional rulers, the House of Bourbon-Parma. This was a family with a truly staggering lineage, a junior branch of the Spanish royal family, who were themselves descended from the Bourbon kings of France. Their veins ran with the blood of Louis XIV, the Sun King. They were the embodiment of the Ancien Régime, the old order of absolute monarchy that the French Revolution had tried and failed to completely extinguish. Life within the walls of the ducal palace was a performance of power and legitimacy. Court ritual was elaborate, etiquette was paramount. It was a world insulated from the concerns of the common farmer or shopkeeper, a bubble of gilded privilege that existed to reinforce one central idea, that the Bourbons were born to rule, and their subjects were born to be ruled. But outside those palace walls, the ground was shifting. The spirit of the Risorgimento, the resurgence, was alive. It was a powerful and romantic movement, fueled by poets, intellectuals, and secret societies, all dreaming of a single, unified, and independent Italian nation. They wanted to cast off the yoke of Austrian influence and sweep away the small, illegitimate monarchies that stood in their way. To the patriots of the Risorgimento, the Duke of Parma was not a divinely appointed sovereign. He was a foreign-backed puppet, an obstacle on the path to Italy's destiny. This was the world Alice was born into, a dynasty living on borrowed time, in a palace whose foundations were being eroded by the tides of history. Her birth on December 27, 1849, was celebrated with all the traditional pomp and circumstance due a princess, but no amount of cannon fire or courtly celebration could disguise the deep, unsettling anxiety that hung over the duchy. Her cradle was rocked by the first tremors of a political earthquake. To understand the tragedy that would soon engulf the family, one must first understand the man at its head, Duke Charles III. If his wife represented the grace and piety of the old French aristocracy, Charles embodied its worst excesses and its fatal inability to adapt. He was not a man built for an age of revolution. Born Carlo Ferdinando, he had spent his youth in exile as the Napoleonic Wars redrew the map of Europe. He was raised not as a future ruler learning the art of governance, but as a dispossessed prince, steeped in a sense of grievance and an unshakable belief in his own absolute right to power. He served in the army of the Kingdom of Sardinia for a time, but his true passion was not for leadership, but for the trappings of military authority, the uniforms, the parades, the rigid discipline he could impose on others. He became Duke of Parma in 1849, following the abdication of his own father, Charles II. The people of Parma, weary of political instability, might have hoped for a ruler who would bring peace and reconciliation. They were to be bitterly disappointed. Charles III ruled with an iron fist. He despised liberalism and constitutionalism, viewing them as diseases that weakened the state. He immediately repealed the modest constitution his father had granted, dissolved Parliament, and established a regime of harsh repression. His political philosophy was simple. The Duke was the state, and any opposition was treason. He staffed his government with reactionaries and gave his police forces sweeping powers of arrest and surveillance. Public floggings were reintroduced for political offenders. The universities were put under strict watch and censorship was rampant. He seemed to take a personal delight in asserting his authority, often in petty and vindictive ways. But his unpopularity was not just political. His personal conduct alienated even those who might have supported a strong monarchy. He was notoriously arrogant and possessed a volatile temper. While he demanded rigid austerity from his state, he spent lavishly on his personal pleasures, particularly his beloved ballet dancers and opera singers. His philandering was an open secret in the small court of Parma, a constant source of humiliation for his devout and long-suffering wife, Duchess Louise Marie Thérèse. He held his own people in contempt, often referring to them as lazy and disloyal. He preferred to surround himself with his Austrian guards and spent long periods at his countryside estates far from the capital. He was, in short, the perfect villain for the nationalist narrative, a decadent, tyrannical ruler propped up by foreign bayonets, completely out of touch with the aspirations of his subjects. He was a man who seemed to be actively courting his own destruction, and in doing so, he was setting the stage for the first great tragedy of his daughter Alice's life. For the young Princess Alice, the Duke of Parma was simply Papa, a distant, formidable figure perhaps, but the center of her universe. Her world was not one of political intrigue, but of lessons with her governess, prayers with her mother, and games with her three older siblings, Margherita, Roberto, and Enrico. The ducal palace of Parma was their gilded cage. Within its walls, they were shielded from the growing hostility of the outside world. Their days were governed by a strict routine of education, religious observance, and courtly training. They learned to speak French, German, and Italian fluently. They studied music, art, and history, a version of history, of course, that emphasized the glory and legitimacy of their own Bourbon dynasty. The dominant force in their young lives was their mother, Duchess Louise Marie-Thérèse. A French princess by birth, she was the granddaughter of the deposed King Charles X of France. Like her husband, she knew the pain of exile, but unlike him, it had not made her bitter or tyrannical. It had instead deepened her already profound Catholic faith and instilled in her a powerful sense of duty. Louise Marie was the warm, nurturing heart of the family. She was devoted to her children and sought to create a sanctuary of love and piety for them amidst the cold formality of the court and the growing danger outside. She oversaw their education personally, ensuring they grew up with a strong moral compass. It was from her that Alice would inherit her quiet resilience, her deep faith, and her unwavering commitment to family. Alice's closest bond was with her brother Roberto, who was just a year older than her. As the eldest son, Roberto was the heir to the duchy, the focus of all dynastic hopes. He was a bright and serious boy, keenly aware from a young age of the weight of his name. The relationship forged between Alice and Roberto in the nursery at Parma would become a cornerstone of her life, a source of comfort and stability through decades of upheaval. Yet, even in this protected sanctuary, the shadow of the outside world could not be entirely kept at bay. The children would have heard the muffled shouts of protesters from the city squares. They would have noticed the increased number of armed guards patrolling the palace grounds. They would have sensed the tension in the hushed conversations of their parents and the worried glances of their attendants. For a sensitive child like Alice, this atmosphere of latent fear must have been a constant, unnerving presence. She was living in a fairy tale, but she could hear a monster scratching at the door. On Sunday, March 26, 1854, the monster broke through the door. Duke Charles III, true to his arrogant nature, often dismissed the need for heavy security. He believed that a sovereign should be able to walk freely among his people, a fatal miscalculation for a man so widely despised. Late that afternoon, he was taking a stroll through the streets of Parma, accompanied only by a single aide-de-camp. He had just observed a military exercise and was walking back towards the palace. The streets were relatively quiet. As he passed near the corner of a street named for Santa Lucia, a figure emerged from the shadows. The man was swift and silent. Before the Duke or his aide could react, the assassin lunged forward, plunging a thin, sharp stiletto deep into the Duke's abdomen. The attack was over in an instant. The assassin melted back into the labyrinthine alleys of the old city, never to be definitively identified. The Duke, mortally wounded, collapsed into the arms of his aide. He was carried back to the palace, leaving a trail of blood on the cobblestones. Inside the palace, panic erupted. The royal physicians were summoned, but they could do nothing. The blade had pierced his liver and stomach. The Duke was bleeding internally, his condition hopeless. For 5-year-old Alice, these hours must have been a terrifying blur of confusion and fear. The sudden chaos, the running servants, the frantic whispers, the sound of her mother's weeping. They brought her and her siblings to their father's bedside to say goodbye. What does a child make of such a scene? A grand, imposing father, now pale and dying in a magnificent bed, the room filled with the smell of blood and fear. It was a trauma that would be seared into her memory for the rest of her life. Duke Charles III lingered through the night in agony. He received the last rites of the church, and in a moment of final clarity, he appointed his wife as the regent of the duchy. At 5:30 p.m. on March 27th, almost exactly 24 hours after the attack, he died. He was 31 years old. The throne of Parma now passed to Alice's brother, a 5-year-old boy. He was now Duke Robert I, and the fate of the duchy and of the entire family rested squarely on the shoulders of their newly widowed mother, the regent Louise Marie. The assassination of a ruler is meant to create chaos, to decapitate the state and spark a revolution. But Charles III's assassins had underestimated his wife. Louise Marie Thérèse, who had until now lived in the shadow of her husband, emerged as a figure of remarkable strength and political intelligence. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, she acted decisively to prevent a total collapse of order. She declared a state of siege, but unlike her husband, she did not respond with blind, brutal repression. She understood that her husband's tyranny had led him to his grave, and that a different path was needed if she were to save the throne for her young son. Her 5-year regency was a delicate and ultimately impossible balancing act. She tried to heal the wounds her husband had inflicted. One of her first acts was to dismiss the most hated members of his government and to release many political prisoners. She sought to rule with justice and clemency, investing in public works and charity, trying to win back the trust of the Parmesans. For Alice and her siblings, their mother was now not just their loving caregiver, but their protector and their sovereign. They would have seen her less as the duties of state consumed her. They would have seen her poring over documents late into the night, meeting with ministers and generals, her face etched with worry. The atmosphere in the palace changed from one of fearful oppression to one of anxious siege. Their mother was no longer just the Duchess. She was the commander of a fortress, trying to hold back an invading army, and the army was indeed gathering. Louise Marie's true struggle was not with her own people, who were somewhat placated by her moderate policies. The real threat came from outside, from the kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, whose brilliant and ruthless prime minister, Camillo de Cavour, was masterminding the unification of Italy. Cavour saw the small duchies as dominoes, ready to be toppled. He secretly funded nationalist agitators within Parma, seeking to destabilize the Duchess's government from within. Louise Marie was caught in an impossible vice. On one side was the revolutionary nationalism championed by Sardinia. On the other was her powerful protector, Austria, which urged her to maintain a hard line and resist any liberal reforms. She tried to carve a middle path, to maintain Parma's independence by showing that it could be a well-governed and moderate state. But in the polarized climate of the 1850s, there was no room for a middle path. One was either for a unified Italy or against it. For 5 years, she held on, a lonely female ruler in a world of powerful men, fighting a desperate battle against the inevitable. For Alice, these were formative years, watching her mother's daily struggle. It was a masterclass in courage, duty, and the lonely burden of leadership. It was a lesson she would never forget. The final act came in the spring of 1859. Cavour had succeeded in his master plan. He provoked Austria into declaring war, which allowed him to trigger his secret military alliance with Emperor Napoleon III of France. The combined French and Sardinian armies swept into northern Italy, inflicting a series of crushing defeats on the Austrians. The Austrian defeat at the Battle of Magenta on June 4th was the death knell for the independent duchies. With the Austrian army in retreat, the nationalist forces within Parma, Modena, and Tuscany saw their chance. The carefully constructed order that had protected Alice's family for a decade shattered in a matter of days. In Parma, Revolutionary committees, funded by Sardinia, took control of the streets. Louise Marie looked to her own army for support, but her troops, mostly native Italians, were sympathetic to the nationalist cause. They were not willing to fire on their own countrymen to protect the throne of a Bourbon prince. The Duchess regent was faced with a terrible choice. She could stay and fight, which would inevitably lead to a bloody and futile civil war, or she could leave, sacrificing her son's throne to save the lives of her people. Always guided by her faith and her conscience, Louise Marie chose peace over power. She refused to be responsible for a single drop of Parmesan blood being shed. On the 9th of June, 1859, she formally protested the revolutionary takeover, but announced she would withdraw with her children until order could be restored. It was a fiction, and she knew it. This was not a temporary withdrawal. This was the end. That night, a small convoy of carriages slipped out of the ducal palace. Inside were the last Bourbons of Parma, the Duchess regent, Louise Marie, the 10-year-old Duke Robert I, now a king without a kingdom, his younger brother Enrico, his older sister Margherita, and 9-year-old Princess Alice. As their carriage rattled over the cobblestones and out of the city gates, Alice looked out the window at the land of her birth for the last time. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known: her home, her country, the grave of her murdered father. In the short span of her life, she had lost a father to an assassin's blade, and now she was losing her homeland to a revolution. Their first stop was Switzerland, then eventually refuge within the borders of the Austrian Empire that had failed to protect them. In March of 1860, a rigged plebiscite was held in Parma, and the result was a foregone conclusion. The duchy voted overwhelmingly to be annexed by the Kingdom of Sardinia, which would soon become the Kingdom of Italy. The Bourbon-Parma dynasty was officially and permanently deposed. Alice's life as an Italian princess was over. Her new life as a princess in exile was about to begin. She was not yet 10 years old. Exile is not a single event. It is a permanent condition. For the dethroned Bourbon-Parma family, the frantic escape from their duchy in 1859 was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. They had lost a kingdom, a home, a future that had been promised to them by God and by centuries of tradition. Now, stripped of everything but their titles, their wealth, and their memories, they had to learn not just how to survive, but how to live. For young Princess Alice, the world had been irrevocably fractured. The trauma of her father's murder was now compounded by the loss of her homeland. At an age when other aristocratic children were concerned with ponies and dance lessons, Alice was grappling with concepts of revolution, loss, and displacement. The journey into Austria was a journey into a gilded wilderness, a world of imperial splendor that was not their own, where they would be simultaneously honored as royal cousins and pitied as political relics. It was here, in this strange new world, that Alice would have to grow up, navigate another profound personal tragedy, and ultimately find a new destiny in a union with a man who was her perfect counterpart, a Grand Duke who also had no Grand Duchy. Their immediate sanctuary was provided by their powerful relatives, the Habsburgs of Austria. Emperor Franz Joseph I, the epitome of a monarchical traditionalist, viewed the rising tide of Italian nationalism with alarm. He saw the dispossession of his Italian cousins not just as a political setback, but as an affront to the sacred order of legitimate monarchy. He welcomed the refugees from Parma, Modena, and Tuscany with the formal sympathy befitting their rank. The Bourbon-Parma family did not settle in the bustling, intrigue-filled capital of Vienna. Instead, their mother, the ever-prudent Louise Marie, chose a quieter existence. They took up residence first at Schwarzau Castle, a sprawling estate in the countryside of Lower Austria. Here, far from the prying eyes of the Viennese court, she could focus on the singular monumental task of raising her 4 orphan children in a world that no longer had a place for them. Life at Schwarzau was a paradox. On the one hand, they were surrounded by immense comfort. The family had managed to secure its considerable private fortune, so they were never in want. They were attended by a retinue of loyal servants who had followed them into exile. Their days were structured with the familiar rhythm of lessons, prayers, and formal meals. Yet, this comfortable existence was haunted by a profound sense of rootlessness. For Alice and her siblings, this was a time of immense adjustment. They had to learn German, the language of their new protectors. They were now guests in a foreign land, their identity a complicated negotiation. In Parma, they were royalty. In Austria, they were high-ranking aristocrats, but they were also the poor relations, the family who had lost their throne. This subtle distinction would have been a constant, unspoken reality. Their education was intensified, as if to compensate for their lack of a kingdom. They studied languages, history, music, and art, not merely as accomplishments, but as essential tools of their identity. If they could no longer rule a territory, they must embody its culture and refinement. For Alice, a quiet and introspective child, this world of books, music, and art became a refuge, while her brother Robert, as the titular duke, was groomed in the finer points of politics and diplomacy. In the faint hope of a future restoration, Alice cultivated the quiet graces that were expected of a princess. She developed a love for the arts and a deep piety, mirroring the example set by her beloved mother. In this period of exile, Louise Marie-Thérèse was the unwavering anchor of the family. Having lost her husband and her throne, she devoted every ounce of her formidable energy to her children. She was no longer a regent of a state, but the matriarch of a dynasty in exile, a role she fulfilled with extraordinary skill and devotion. She meticulously managed the family's finances, ensuring that their fortune was preserved and invested wisely. This financial independence was crucial. It meant they were not dependent on the charity of their Habsburg relations and could maintain their own household with dignity. She understood that without land or power, money was the last bastion of their standing. More importantly, she was the guardian of their identity. She created a court in exile at Schwarzau, a small recreation of the world they had lost. Italian was the primary language spoken within the family. The traditions of Parma were carefully maintained. She instilled in her children an intense sense of who they were, Bourbons of Parma, princes and princesses of a lost but glorious heritage. It was an education in memory, a refusal to let the Risorgimento erase them from history. She also began the work of securing their futures in the only way available to exiled royalty, through strategic marriages. She looked to the intricate network of deposed or non-reigning Catholic dynasties. It was a small, exclusive world of legitimist royals who refused to recognize the new political map of Europe. In 1864, she successfully arranged the marriage of her eldest daughter, Margarita, to Carlos, Duke of Madrid, the Carlist claimant to the throne of Spain. It was a union of two what-if dynasties, a marriage based on shared principles and a shared state of dispossession. But the immense strain of the past decade, the murder of her husband, the loss of her duchy, the constant anxiety for her children's future, had taken its toll on her health. In early 1864, while visiting Venice, Louise Marie fell gravely ill with typhus. She was brought to the Palazzo Giustiniani, where she rapidly declined. On February 1st, 1864, surrounded by her grieving children, Louise Marie-Thérèse of France, Duchess of Parma, and regent in exile, passed away. She was only 44 years old. For 14-year-old Alice, her mother's death was a devastating blow. If her father's murder had destroyed her world, her mother's death removed its very foundation. Louise Marie had been her shield, her teacher, her role model, the living embodiment of their family's resilience. Now she was gone. Alice and her 3 siblings were truly orphans, adrift in the vast sea of European politics, with only each other to rely on. The head of their house was now her brother Robert, a boy of 15. As Alice entered womanhood, navigating the grief of her mother's passing, another royal exile in Austria was living out a story that was a near-perfect mirror of her own. His name was Ferdinand, and he was the last reigning Grand Duke of Tuscany. His family, the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, had ruled Tuscany for over a century. Unlike the autocratic Bourbon of Parma, the Tuscan Habsburgs were renowned as enlightened and benevolent rulers. They had made their capital, Florence, a beacon of culture and liberal thought. They had abolished the death penalty, reformed the laws, and were generally beloved by their people. Ferdinand himself, who ascended to the throne in 1859, for a brief period after his father's abdication, was a gentle and cultured man, deeply devoted to his land and its people. But benevolence was no defense against the tide of nationalism. In April 1859, just weeks before the Bourbons fled Parma, a peaceful but determined popular uprising in Florence demanded that Tuscany join the cause of Italian unification. Like Louise Marie in Parma, Ferdinand faced a choice. His Austrian generals urged him to use force to allow their troops to crush the rebellion. Ferdinand refused. He would not permit a single drop of his subjects' blood to be shed to preserve his throne. On April the 27th, 1859, in an act of profound sorrowful dignity, Ferdinand IV and his family drove out of the Pitti Palace in Florence and into exile, while the crowds in the streets watched in respectful silence. There was no violence, no hatred, just the quiet, tragic recognition that an era had ended. His story was a haunting echo of Alice's. The same year, the same revolutionary force, the same principled refusal to resort to civil war. His personal life, too, had been marked by tragedy. He had been happily married to Princess Anna of Saxony, but their joy was short-lived. In 1859, the same year he lost his throne, his young wife died from typhus after giving birth to their daughter, Archduchess Maria Antonietta. Now living in exile in Salzburg, Ferdinand was a widower, a deposed monarch, and a single father. He was a man who, like Alice, understood the profound fragility of happiness and power. He had lost a wife and a kingdom in the space of a single year. The world of Catholic royalty in the Austrian Empire, particularly for the exiled, was a small and interconnected one. They attended the same balls at the Hofburg Palace, prayed in the same chapels, and summered in the same spa towns. It was inevitable that the paths of the orphaned Princess of Parma and the widowed Grand Duke of Tuscany would cross. Their courtship, when it began, was not a fiery romance of youthful passion. It was something quieter, deeper, and perhaps more meaningful. He was Ferdinand, 32 years old. She was Alice, just 18. The 14-year age gap was significant, but it was bridged by a lifetime of shared experience. When they spoke, they did not need to explain the phantom pain of a lost crown or the lingering sorrow of a life lived in the shadow of what might have been. Each was a living reflection of the other's fate. What did Ferdinand see in Alice? He saw a young woman of grace, piety, and quiet strength who had endured immense tragedy without becoming bitter. He saw in her the spirit of her mother, Louise Marie, a woman he would have admired for her courage. He saw a partner who would understand the unique duties of being a consort without a country. And what did Alice see in Ferdinand? She saw a kind, honorable, and gentle man, not a tyrant like her father, but a ruler who had sacrificed his throne for his people's well-being. She saw a fellow soul who understood loss, a mature and stable presence who could offer her the security and home she had lacked since her mother's death. Their union was formally arranged by their respective families, with Alice's brother Robert, as head of the House of Bourbon-Parma, giving his consent. But it was far from a cold political arrangement. It was a match of profound compatibility, a partnership founded on the solid rock of mutual empathy. On January 11, 1868, they were married at Frosdorf Castle, a residence of their French Bourbon relatives. The guest list was a who's who of legitimist and exiled European royalty. It was a grand affair, a defiant statement that even without thrones, their dynasties endured. Yet, beneath the pomp and ceremony, this was a deeply personal moment. Two people cast adrift by the storm of history had found a safe harbor in each other. Alice of Bourbon-Parma was now by marriage Her Imperial and Royal Highness Alice, Grand Duchess of Tuscany. It was a magnificent title for a queen with no kingdom, marrying a king with no throne. Ferdinand and Alice chose not to live in the political hothouse of Vienna. Instead, they made their home in the beautiful, music-filled city of Salzburg. It was a deliberate choice for a life of relative privacy and peace, away from the constant reminders of what they had lost. They purchased a grand residence which they named the Villa Toscana, and it was here that Alice would embark on the most fulfilling chapter of her life. Her new role was to be the chatelaine of her own court and the mother of a new generation. After a childhood of uncertainty and a youth defined by loss, she finally had a home that was truly hers. She threw herself into creating a sanctuary of stability, culture, and love, a private kingdom built not on land, but on family. The Villa Toscana became a center for their large and growing family. Alice proved to be a devoted wife and a wonderfully nurturing mother. In the first 7 years of their marriage, she gave birth to 5 of their eventual 10 children: Leopold Ferdinand in 1868, Louise in 1870, Joseph Ferdinand in 1872, Peter Ferdinand in 1874, and Heinrich Ferdinand in 1878. Life in Salzburg was a happy recreation of the best parts of her own childhood, but without the constant shadow of political threat. The household was run with the etiquette of a royal court, but it was filled with the warmth of a loving family. Italian was the language of the home, and Alice and Ferdinand instilled in their children a deep awareness of their Tuscan and Parmesan heritage. They were raising archdukes and archduchesses of Austria and princes and princesses of Tuscany. But more importantly, they were raising them to be a close-knit, mutually supportive family. For Alice, this was the ultimate triumph over her tragic past. She had lost her father, her mother, and her country. But now, in this peaceful Austrian city, she had found a devoted husband and was surrounded by her own happy, healthy children. She had taken the fragments of 2 broken dynasties and was building something new and whole. She could not reclaim the throne of Parma, but she had successfully built a kingdom of the heart, a personal realm where she was finally and truly the queen. The lost princess had found her haven. Life at the Villa Toscana unfolded in an almost unchanging rhythm, and the family continued to grow, a living testament to their love. 5 more children were born after Heinrich Ferdinand: Anna Maria in 1879, Margareta in 1881, Germana in 1884, Robert Ferdinand in 1885, and Agnes Teresa in 1887. 10 children in all, a miniature dynasty nurtured in the peace of Salzburg. But beyond this idyllic island, the world was being reshaped by forces that Alice and Ferdinand's generation could scarcely comprehend. Nationalism, the very movement that had cost them their thrones, had morphed from a romantic ideal into an aggressive ideology, creating fierce rivalries between nations. The Industrial Revolution had transformed society, creating new classes and new tensions. A silent but intense arms race was underway between the great powers. From Salzburg, Alice and Ferdinand watched all this like spectators at a theater. They read the newspapers, corresponded with their relatives in courts across Europe, and surely felt the growing sense of unease. They had lived through the unifications of Germany and Italy, witnessed the decline of the Ottoman Empire, and now saw the scramble for colonies in Africa and Asia. Their world, a Europe governed by an interconnected web of royal cousins, was slowly being replaced by a world of cold, hard military alliances. The Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Great Britain. Their family was geographically nested within the heart of one of those blocks, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Faced with a world that was becoming increasingly alien and menacing, Alice poured all her energy into the most important role of her life, that of a mother. She did not just give birth to 10 children, she raised them with a distinct purpose. If she could not give them a crown, she would give them a moral compass and a profound sense of their own identity. The education of the Tuscan children was a complex task. Who were they? They were archdukes and archduchesses of Austria, bearing the titles of the ruling Habsburg dynasty. But they were also princes and princesses of Tuscany, heirs to a throne that no longer existed. And in their veins also flowed the blood of the Bourbon-Parmas. Alice taught them to be proud of all these legacies. Their home was a microcosm of old Europe. Italian was the language of family affection, of remembrance for Florence and Parma. German was the language of daily life and of loyalty to Emperor Franz Joseph. French was the language of culture and diplomacy, a legacy from Alice's own mother. Her children grew up not just multilingual, but multicultural, embodying an older world where identity was not constrained by rigid national borders. Alice passed on her deep Catholic faith, seeing it as a spiritual anchor in a world that was losing its certainties. She taught them of dignity, of duty, and of a unique kind of patriotism. Not a patriotism for an existing nation-state, but a loyalty to their family's heritage and the lands they once ruled. It was a burden, but it was also an honor. While Alice found absolute fulfillment in her maternal role, life for Ferdinand during these long years of exile was more complex. He was a man born and educated to rule, but for nearly half a century, he had no country to govern, no government to lead, no people to serve. He had accepted his fate with a quiet dignity. He was a devoted husband and a loving father, but there was always a void in his life that family could not fill. He dedicated his time to art, music, and science, the passions of a Renaissance ruler. He was a generous patron to artists in Salzburg and maintained an impressive private library. But for a man who had once held the destiny of a nation in his hands, the life of a wealthy country gentleman must have carried a profound sadness. He was a living relic, a symbol of a bygone world. With each passing year, the hope of a restoration in Tuscany faded further, until it was extinguished completely. The years took their toll on his health. 40 years had passed since his wedding day, 40 years in which he and Alice had built a life from the ashes of their past. On January 17, 1908, Ferdinand IV, the last Grand Duke of Tuscany, died peacefully in Salzburg. He was 72 years old. For Alice, now 58, this was the third great loss of her life. She had lost her father, her mother, and now her husband, her companion, her ally, the one person in the world who truly understood her journey and her pain. She was once again the head of a fatherless family, just as her mother had been. But this time, she was not navigating the fallout of a political storm, but preparing to face the collapse of an entire civilization. After her husband's death, Alice continued to live a quiet life at the Villa Toscana, acting as the matriarch and center of her sprawling family of children and grandchildren. She might have expected her final years to pass in peace, surrounded by her loved ones, but the world would not allow it. On June 28, 1914, news from a distant city in the Balkans called Sarajevo shook Europe to its core. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sophie had been assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. For most, it was a political crisis, but for Alice it carried a terrifyingly personal echo. Once again, an assassination was the trigger for a catastrophe. Her father's murder had led to the fall of the Duchy of Parma. This assassination of a distant Habsburg relative was about to lead to the fall of a world. In the tense weeks of July 1914, as diplomats exchanged ultimatums and emperors issued orders for mobilization, Alice surely watched with a familiar sense of dread. She had seen this before. She knew a storm was coming. But not even she, who had lived through so much upheaval, could have imagined the scale and brutality of the storm that was about to break. The war that would engulf Europe would not only pit nations against each other, it would pit her family's very heritage against itself, forcing her sons to face an impossible choice and destroying the last world that had given her refuge. The assassination in Sarajevo ignited a chain reaction that no one could control. Within weeks, the complex alliance system of Europe had dragged every great power into war. For millions, it was the Great War, the conflict that was supposed to end all wars and be over by Christmas. They were tragically mistaken. For Alice of Bourbon-Parma, this was not a political adventure. It was a looming family tragedy, a conflict that would pit loyalty against blood, and that would destroy the very foundations of the world that had sheltered her for half a century. When war erupted in the summer of 1914, Alice was confronted with the most painful irony of her life. Her sons, as holders of Tuscan princely titles and as officers in the imperial and royal army, answered the call of duty. They put on the uniform of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to fight for their emperor. Their adopted homeland was now at war. But in May of 1915, the tragedy deepened. The Kingdom of Italy, after months of hesitation, abandoned its alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary and declared war on the Central Powers. Now, Alice's homeland of the heart, the land of Parma and Florence she had taught her children to love, was the enemy. Imagine her torment. Her sons would likely be sent to the Italian front to fight against Italian soldiers in the very lands they were born to rule. Her heritage was now bisected by trenches and barbed wire. Every Austrian victory on the Italian front would be a blow to her Tuscan legacy, and every Italian victory could bring news of a son's death. For Alice, there were no victors in this war, only loss. She lived every day in dread of the telegram that would bring the worst possible news. Alice's sons served as was expected of them. Joseph Ferdinand was a capable commander in the Air Force, while Peter Ferdinand served in the artillery. They fought bravely for Austria-Hungary, but the psychological burden must have been immeasurable. They were fighting a war against a part of their own soul. The Austro-Italian front was one of the most brutal of the war, with bloody battles fought across treacherous mountain terrain. The names of Isonzo and Caporetto became synonymous with slaughter. The princes of Tuscany witnessed the horrors of modern warfare firsthand. The poison gas, the relentless artillery, the anonymous death in the mud. The world of order and honor in which they were raised had vanished in the roar of the cannons. They had left as princes of the 19th century and would return, if they were lucky enough to survive, as traumatized men of the 20th. While Alice's sons were fighting at the front, her own Bourbon-Parma family was unexpectedly thrust into the very epicenter of the war. In November 1916, the aged Emperor Franz Joseph I died. His successor was his grandnephew, Archduke Karl, who became Emperor Karl I of Austria and King Charles IV of Hungary. And Karl's wife, now the empress of an empire at war, was Zita of Bourbon-Parma. Zita was the daughter of Robert I, Alice's beloved brother. She was Alice's niece. This meant that the granddaughter of a dispossessed duke was now the empress of the very empire that had given their family refuge. Zita and Karl were people of conscience, horrified by the slaughter and desperate to bring the war to an end. Most famously, this led to the Sixtus Affair in 1917, where they used Zita's brothers, Alice's nephews, as secret intermediaries to try and negotiate a separate peace with France. The attempt ultimately failed and caused a major political scandal when it was revealed, but it showed that the Parma family, even without a throne of their own, was at the heart of world-shaping events. But no peace effort could save the crumbling Central Powers. By the autumn of 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was exhausted, its army disintegrated, and its various nationalities, Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, South Slavs, declared their independence. The great multinational empire, which had defined Central Europe for over 600 years, fell apart in a matter of weeks. On November 11, 1918, Emperor Karl I relinquished all part in the administration of the state. He and Zita were forced into exile. The Habsburg dynasty was finished. For Alice, this was a second cataclysm, a replaying of her childhood nightmare on a far grander scale. In 1859, she had lost her kingdom. Now in 1918, she had lost the empire that had adopted her. Her father's world had crumbled when she was a child. Now, her husband's world had also vanished into thin air. She had lived long enough to see two worlds fall. The First World War left behind a shattered Europe and a traumatized generation. The German, Russian, Ottoman, and Austro-Hungarian empires were gone. New borders were drawn, new republics were born. For the survivors of the old world, like Alice and her family, the future was profoundly uncertain. They had lost not only the status and protection of an empire, they were about to become strangers in the very land they had called home. The newly formed Republic of Austria saw the Habsburg family not as a symbol of history, but as a potential threat. In April 1919, the government passed the Habsburg Law, which banished all members of the former ruling house who did not renounce their titles and swear allegiance to the Republic. This law struck Alice's family directly. Though not Habsburgs by name, her children held the titles of archdukes and archduchesses of Austria and were considered part of the former imperial house. They faced a grim choice: renounce their heritage or leave their home. Once again, they were exiles. Many of them had to leave Austria, scattering to other countries. The great family unit that Alice had so carefully nurtured in Salzburg was now broken apart by politics. Alice, now in her 70s, was permitted to stay. She moved to Schwertberg Castle in Upper Austria. This would be her final home. Life here was a world away from the former vibrancy of Salzburg. It was a life of near total quiet, of seclusion. During these final years, she lived through a world that was changing beyond recognition. She witnessed the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and the rise of the radical ideologies born from post-war despair. In her native Italy, Benito Mussolini and his fascists were in power. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were on their ascent. Ironically, these movements, with their extreme nationalism, were the monstrous but logical successors to the same Risorgimento that had deposed her family decades earlier. Alice had lived long enough to see the embers of nationalism become a continental firestorm. She was a living relic from another age, a silent witness to the madness of the 20th century. On November 16, 1935, Alice of Bourbon-Parma, the last Grand Duchess of Tuscany, died peacefully at Schwertberg Castle. She was 85 years old. Her life, which had begun amidst the pomp and circumstance of an Italian palace, ended in the quiet solitude of a remote Austrian castle. She died in exile, just as she had lived most of her life. She was buried not in Parma or Florence, but in the imperial crypt in Vienna, next to her beloved husband, Ferdinand. She rests among the emperors and empresses of a non-existent empire, a final symbolic irony. A princess with no kingdom, buried in the crypt of an empire with no future. Her story is a powerful human testament to the ability to endure unimaginable tragedy with grace and resilience. She teaches us that history is not just about battles and treaties. It is about the human lives caught in their wake, of those who do not make events but must learn to live with their consequences. She embodies the end of an era, the world of dynastic rule, of a Europe connected by blood rather than ideology. But more importantly, she is a symbol of the triumph of quiet virtues. In a world that celebrates power and ambition, Alice's life celebrates dignity and loss, strength and stillness, and the endurance of family love against all the storms of history. She was dispossessed of a kingdom of bricks and mortar, but she succeeded in building a kingdom of the heart, a dynasty of family and memory that no revolution or war could ever fully destroy. Alice of Bourbon-Parma may be a forgotten princess in the grand sweep of history, but her story, a story of the quiet strength of a survivor, deserves to be told and remembered forever.